And we pray.
Friends, if you have your Bibles, let's open up to the book of Hosea. The book of Hosea, chapter 4. We're moving right along through this prophet, this minor prophet, Old Testament prophet, and at this point in the text, things are going to change slightly. If you look at verses or chapters 1 through 3, it's very linear. It moves like a narrative, like we would expect in an Old Testament story. God gives us the description of what is happening. He tells us what is going to happen next because of our disobedience or because of the sinfulness of the nation of Israel. And then in a linear way, a type of story, he tells us of the redemption that's going to take place. And then in chapter 3, we see that lived out in the analogy of Hosea's life with Gomer, what the Lord as the righteous one, as the Holy One, is going to do on behalf of the people, our unrighteousness, our unfaithfulness, but he is going to offer us redemption. That is played out in the life of Hosea with Gomer. Starting with chapter 4 and the following chapters of Hosea, they are not going to be thought of like a story, but more like a theological principle, like the events that have taken place and the events that are going to take place, because this is a prophetic book. In chapters 1 through 3. This is the remaining chapters, arguably the majority of the book of Hosea, is going to be God explaining the theological principle behind it. This is where we can really get our application. It's not just a story that happened thousands of years ago, where we can see it and understand what is going to happen with us, God's people, if we disobey God, how his punishment, how his discipline is going to come on us, and then the later redemption that's going to take place. But really, how can we make sure that we don't get in this situation to start with? How can our faithfulness be lived out on a daily basis rather than neglecting God, forgetting God, and then having to be disciplined and rebuked by God because of our unfaithfulness to him? And so think of these following chapters, and they're going to go up and down. We're going to have discipline, we're going to have redemption, we're going to have God explaining all these things to us, but think of them more in lines of a theological principle, the character of God, rather than a linear Old Testament narrative that we are used to as we read through the books of the Old Testament. So starting with verse 1 of Hosea chapter 4, we're going to read it in its entirety. It says, "Hear the word of the Lord, O children of Israel. For the Lord has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land. There is no faithfulness or steadfast love, and no knowledge of God in the land. There is swearing, lying, murder, stealing, and committing adultery. They break all bonds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Therefore the land mourns, and all who dwell in it languish. And also the beasts of the field and the birds of the heavens, even the fish of the sea are taken away. This has affected all of creation within the nation of Israel. Yet let no one contend, and let no one accuse, for with you is my contention, O priest. You shall stumble by day, the prophet shall stumble with you by night, and I will destroy your mother here being the nation of Israel itself. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I reject you from being a priest to me. And since you have forgotten the law of your God, I will also forget your children. The more they increase, the more they sinned against me. I will change their glory into shame. They feed on the sin of my people. They are greedy for their iniquity. And it shall be like people, like priests. I will punish them for their ways and repay them for their deeds. They shall eat but not be satisfied. They shall play the whore but not multiply, because they have forsaken the Lord to cherish whoredom, wine, and new wine, which take away the understanding, this being the understanding of God. My people inquire of a piece of wood, and their walking staff gives them oracles. Idolatry. This is idolatry that is rampant in the land. For a spirit of whoredom has led them astray, and they have left their God to play the whore. They sacrifice on the tops of the mountain and burn offerings on the hills under oak, poplar, and terebinth, because their shade is good. Therefore your daughters play the whore, and your brides commit adultery. I will not punish your daughters, nor the brides when they commit adultery, for the men themselves go aside with prostitutes and sacrifice with cold prostitutes, and people without understanding shall come to ruin. Though you play the whore, O Israel, let not Judah become guilty. Enter not into Gilgal, nor up upon Bethaven, and swear not as the Lord lives. Like a stubborn heifer, Israel is stubborn. Can the Lord now feed them like a lamb in a broad pasture? Ephraim is joined to idols. Leave him alone. When their drink is gone, they give themselves to whoring. The rulers dearly love shame. A wind has wrapped them in its wings, and they shall be ashamed because of their sacrifices. That is a lot of verses, a lot of information wrapped right there in Hosea chapter 4. There are two parts of this book that cannot be missed. That absolutely cannot be missed. The first is the obvious analogy of Hosea's life to the disobedience of the nation of Israel. That's really what makes this unique, a unique piece of Old Testament writing. We talked about this from the very beginning, that the Lord is taking one of his prophets and using his very life as an analogy of what the nation of Israel is actually doing to God. So that's the first part. The second is that the message is intended for all of the northern kingdom. It is a blanket message for all the inhabitants of Israel. This is made very clear here in chapter 4. It is a message that is delivered to a nation and not just a few pockets of sinfulness. Much like the condemnation of Sodom and Gomorrah that we see with the Abraham narrative, this anger that God expresses is for the collective actions of all the people. Unlike Sodom and Gomorrah, there is no escape for the righteous. There is no offer for people like Lot and his family to flee because they are righteous in the midst of unrighteous people. The fate of this nation is completely tied together. This is not just because every man, woman, and child in the northern kingdom of Israel is wicked. Hosea is a righteous man, and it can be argued that he suffers most of all in this situation because he is going to have the punishment on all of creation that we just talked about here. He's going to have to endure that. But in order to bring the people back to God, he's also going to be married to this unfaithful woman. He's going to be responsible for these illegitimate children. And so God's prophet, God's man, at this point in time, actually has a harder life than all the other people. It is the truth of sin and the result of living in a fallen world that sometimes we are all in the same boat. Sometimes we have to suffer the consequences of unrighteous people. The church has to suffer the consequences of an unrighteous nation or an unrighteous culture. We are all in this together. Sometimes we sail together, and other times we sink together, based on the righteousness or unrighteousness of the nation, of the people that we are a part of. This is the truth of the Bible. It's the truth of sin. Here in verse 1 of chapter 4, Hosea says, "Hear the word of the Lord, O children of Israel." He is talking to the entire nation, not just the unrighteous. The Lord has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land. Why? Because there is no faithfulness. There is no steadfast love. There is no knowledge of God in all the land. In all the land. This is a collective act. Of course there's knowledge of God. Of course there's love. Hosea the prophet is part of this nation. But as a collective group, there is no love of God. There is only neglect of God. There is no knowledge of God. There's only hatred of God's ways. This is the behavior of all the people. So how does a nation as a whole, how does a culture, if you're looking back at the Old Testament and looking at how the people got to this point, we talked about the divided kingdom here and there in the first week of this, and the sinfulness of the people that just grew and grew and grew from generation to generation. Same thing can be seen in our world today. It doesn't just happen overnight. The immorality, the turning away from God, it happens from generation to generation to generation. It's a slow fade over time. It's not something that just creeps in and pops up all of a sudden. How does a group of people move from the worship of God to the neglect of God in a few generations? Well, this is where we really get some examples that we can take to heart, because Hosea gives us some very clear evidence on this, evidence that we need to see as a warning for us in our own lives. He tells us very clearly in verse 6 that it is from the lack of knowledge that the people have slipped into a pattern of generational sin. One group after another after another. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 7 tells us that we are to remember the commands of God and teach them diligently to our children, and shall talk of them when we sit in our house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. But the people had forgotten the words of Deuteronomy 6. They had also forgotten the words of Deuteronomy 11, where the command is repeated word for word to the people. They thought it important enough to repeat it word for word, that we are to remember who the Lord is, that we are to gain the knowledge of God, that we are to increase in the knowledge of God, not to neglect it. We cannot expect people to know God, know what is right, know what is wrong, obey that command, unless we are willing to teach it, unless we are willing to show it in our lives, unless we are willing as parents to make absolutely sure that we impress upon our children the importance of God, and then we, as a community of believers, go and teach that to other people within our community. That it starts with our family, that we raise up our children in the knowledge of God, but we don't just leave it there, but we also go outside the walls of our church and go outside the walls of our home, and we share that with our community as well. This is not happening, and the knowledge of God, the truth of God, has been forgotten. It's been replaced with the so-called knowledge of other gods that the surrounding nations have brought into Israel, and they have taken that as truth because they've neglected, they've forgotten, they failed to teach from generation to generation the knowledge of God. And when this fails to happen, you end up with a situation like what Israel was in, and you end up in a situation like we are in today. And that is a situation where we had a culture with a very, very low biblical IQ. Low biblical IQ leads to high neglect of biblical morality. This is a professional term, biblical IQ, that's used for pastors and theologians to describe the knowledge of God that a country, culture, or congregation has. How much do we actually know about God? How much do we actually put that knowledge into practice? This is what a biblical IQ measures. It's not just measuring the Bible stories that we have, asking the questions of what was the giant's name that was killed by King David. That's not a measure of biblical IQ, but more along the lines of answering the question, why do people who never hear about Jesus die and go to hell anyway? The way in which we can answer that question would measure our biblical IQ. What's the principle here? How do we understand total depravity? That it doesn't matter what you hear or what you believe, that we are hellbound simply because of what we choose to do, what we choose to value within our life. And that is against God whether we know it or not. Reading Bible stories to our children will not get them to heaven. Taking our children to church will not get them to heaven. We have to teach our children what it means to need Jesus, to need a Savior. We have to teach our neighbors through our words and our deeds what it means to act like Jesus, to show the love and compassion and grace of heaven here on earth. Just having the information isn't good enough. That's not Bible knowledge. That's not a biblical IQ. God does not tell the people here that he has a controversy with them because they have not memorized enough Scripture. He says that at the end of verse 1, there is no faithfulness or steadfast love or knowledge of God in the land. There is no joining of the knowledge that we're supposed to have of God with the actions that we're supposed to do in our normal everyday life. There is no connection. There's only neglect of the Lord because we have forgotten. In fact, we do not know the very basics of faith. I had the opportunity to coach Sawyer's basketball team this year, 9 to 11-year-olds. And I learned very quickly, this is my first time actually coaching one of my children in a sport. I learned very, very quickly that you cannot assume that the kids know anything about basketball, even 9 to 11-year-olds. You have to teach them the very, very basic, like to the point of when you're not on offense, you have to play defense. That it is not against the rules for somebody to try and take the ball from you. These are the basics of basketball. And you have to teach them the very basics. You cannot assume that they know any of it. I'm not so sure that the church in America would not be better if just for a generation we went back to the very fundamental basics of the Bible. What it means to need salvation, where that salvation comes from, how that salvation can come from no other person, no other place. Because we just don't see that. We just don't have that in America anymore. We do not know the things that we should know, and we have not taught them to our children. So when these 18 and 19-year-old kids go off to college and they hear for the first time somebody tell them something that is actually explaining something about the world, or something about religion, or something about philosophy, and it doesn't line up with what they've heard in church, because they've never actually been taught. They just been presented some stories and some words to memorize, and they don't take them to heart, and they don't use that knowledge to then change their behavior. They don't know how to react to something coming against that. And so they drift away from the faith. We have got to teach generation upon generation, young and old, what it means, the basics of what it means to have faith in the Lord. Without proper knowledge of God, we cannot hope to serve God faithfully. One of the things we have to stop doing as a global church is stop thinking that Sunday morning is our faith practice to God. Going back to the basketball analogy, you don't have a single kid that played in that league that I coached or was on another team who signed up for basketball to go to the practices without playing the games. They sign up to play the games. Practice is just one of the things that they do to prepare them for the game. We've got a church in America, and we've got a global church who sees Sunday, what we do here today, what we're doing right now, as being in the game. This is practice. This is what we do to prepare us for exercising our life of faith. Faith is done Monday through Saturday. This is our day to gain knowledge so that we can work Monday through Saturday. This is our day of rest so that we can be refreshed to work Monday through Saturday with the work of the ministry. Sharing, discipling, evangelizing, doing missions. We have got to get away from thinking that Sunday morning is our faith practice, because it's not. Our game, so to speak, happens Monday through Saturday. This knowledge and practice was missing in the nation of Israel. And friends, it's missing in the 21st century church as well. We're not preparing ourselves to change the world for the sake of the gospel, for the glory of God. We're content to sit on the sidelines and never get in the game, and we're left with a country that neglects the Lord, much like the nation of Israel had neglected the Lord in his ways, and there was no knowledge. There was only evil in the land. And as we're sitting on the sidelines and we look around at things that we wish we could change but have no desire to go out there and help be the change, and that leads us to do nothing but complain to each other, and within ourselves we even complain to God, whether we want to admit it or not. Lord, why are you allowing this to happen to me? I'm faithful to come to church 1 hour out of every week. I'm a good person. Why is all this negativity happening to me? And now why is all this negativity happening to my world? What is happening to my country, to my culture, to my congregation? What more do you want from me? And the answer is, he wants us to get in the game. Verse 4, he tells us, let no one contend, let no one accuse, for with you is my contention, O priest. The priest being the nation of Israel, who is supposed to be a kingdom of priests to God. We see that again in the law of Moses. You who shall stumble by day, and the prophet shall stumble with you by night, and I will destroy your mother. This is Israel. He is not talking to other people. Here, sometimes we read the Bible and we hear a message, or we think about something, and we think God must be talking about other people. He's not talking about me, but in fact the Lord is talking about the entire nation of Israel, the mother to all of them. He is going to hold them responsible, and it is all of them who are complaining about this. And he says that none of them can contend, none of them can accuse, because they are all sinful, and God is righteous. If we were righteous to start with, they would know that they deserve what's about to happen to them. Hosea knows that they deserve what's about to happen to them. That's why he's willing to go through this metaphor within his own life of marrying Gomer and having these illegitimate children, with the hope of disciplining the people back to the Lord. If they were where they were supposed to be faithfully, they would have seen their sinfulness and neglect, and that they were sitting on the sidelines, and they wouldn't be complaining. But here we have them accusing the Lord of something. But here's what we can take from this and apply this to our own lives as we think about our contention with God, or our contentment with our own lives. It's that faithless people cannot argue with God, and faithful ones have no need to. We have no need to argue with God. Job chapter 38 gives God's response to Job's one complaint against his situation. During the entire book, he has one complaint about what's happening to him. And God really puts Job in his place here. And he makes it very clear that no one, not even someone who is as righteous as Job, no one can complain about God's treatment of us. Because we are not righteous. Even the most righteous, even the most holy person on the earth has sinned, has neglect of God, has outright rebellion against God. And we cannot complain about our situation because the Lord has already done far more for us than we deserve. Righteous people, faithful people, we understand this. Part of our complaints to God is a result of God giving us exactly what we ask for. Think about that for a second. Sometimes we want something within our worldly selves, our worldly lives, and God gives us exactly what we ask for, and then we complain about it. Here in those verses 15 to 19, he tells the people, though you play the whore, O Israel, let not Judah become guilty. Enter not into Gilgal. This is a place between Jordan and Jericho. And in Joshua 5 and 1 Samuel is described as a holy place to God. So enter not into Gilgal, nor go up to Beth-aven. Bethel means house of God. The word is purposely changed here, Beth-aven, which means house of deceit. So God's not happy and does not want Judah's holy places desecrated as Israel's has been. And swear not as the Lord lives, for like a stubborn heifer, Israel is stubborn. Can the Lord now feed them like a lamb in a broad pasture? I love God's language here. If I said something like this normally to somebody, I'd have something thrown at me, but it's in the Bible, so it's okay. You can call somebody a stubborn heifer. It's perfectly acceptable. He's saying to prove a point here, Israel, or Ephraim, as it's called, is a fallen nation, is fallen into sin. God encourages Judah not to follow suit with their behavior, not to want what they wanted, because God has given them exactly what they wanted. But more than that, because Israel is stubborn, God is not going to lead them like a sweet-spirited lamb. He's going to lead them in the pasture exactly where they want to stay, because they are a stubborn heifer. This practice of God giving us what we want to prove a point is present in the New Testament as well. Romans chapter 1. Paul gives us an example of God doing this with sexually immoral people of Paul's day. It says, for this reason, because of their unrighteousness, their rebellion, their sexual immorality, for this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For the women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men, receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. This is a clear New Testament example of the sin of homosexuality. You can think of, you hear the argument in the world of homosexuality, the sin of homosexuality being an Old Testament concept. Here's a clear example of a New Testament sin of homosexuality. It is actually the only specific mention of female homosexuality in the entire Bible. All other mentions in the Old Testament and in the New Testament Greek are in the Greek masculine form. It's the only example of female homosexuality in the entire Bible. So this is also wrong. But the point is that verse 26 and verse 28, it says God gave them up to the deeds that they wanted. When we act like stubborn heifers, God is not going to treat us like sweet-spirited lambs. He's not going to take us into the greener pastures that we want. If we want to stay exactly where we are in the mire and the muck and the sinfulness of our deeds, He's going to let us stay right there until we learn to come back to Him. He's going to look down and say, all right, I told you the right things to do. I sent you my Son to die so that you don't have to be perfect in them. You just have to have a little bit of effort. If still after all of that you want to stay where you're at, you want to be a stubborn heifer, I will let you do that. And you're going to reap the consequences of that sin. Because it's wrong. It is sin. But faithless people cannot argue with God, and faithful people have no need to. The really hard thing to accept is when consequences of unrighteous behavior end up hitting the righteous. But again, if we understand this is for God's glory, we won't complain. Verse 14 says, I will not punish your daughters when they play the whore, nor your brides when they commit adultery, for the men themselves go aside with prostitutes and sacrifice with cold prostitutes, and people without understanding shall come to ruin. This is interesting because it makes it very clear that the men are going to be punished more than the other members of society. And guys, we like looking at passages like Ephesians 5 and 1 Peter 3 And all the ones that say, wives, be subject, literally it says be in subjection to your husbands. You want to quote that, we need to understand that this goes right along with it. God has given the masculine gender authority in the home and in the church, and that doesn't come without responsibilities, and that doesn't come without consequences. And part of that is when things go wrong, even if it's not your fault, you're going to be held responsible in the home, in the family, in the church. There's nothing more precious to God, so when we do not cherish these things and protect them, God is going to come first for us. That is the truth of the Bible. This, coupled with the collective warning to all of Israel in verse 1, shows us very clearly that God judges individually and collectively. There's going to be a judgment on you, and there's going to be a judgment on me based on my deeds. There's also going to be a judgment on us as a church congregation, how well we faithfully exercise the will of God. There's going to be a judgment on our community. There's going to be a judgment on our state. There's going to be a judgment on our nation. And yes, there's going to be a judgment collectively on the world for our disobedience. He judges us individually and collectively. This is why, whether it is your spouse or your job or your church or whoever or wherever you decide to spend your life, choosing the right collective group is vital. Because sometimes we're judged as the group for the glory of God. You know, I mentioned Job earlier. If there was ever an example of a collective hardship for the sake of the gospel, it is Job. God allows Job, this righteous man, to be tested by Satan for no other reason than the glory of God, than the sake of the gospel. And Job and Hosea had a lot in common here. A major part of Hosea's hardship was the family. His unfaithful wife and his illegitimate children. And if we think about Job, God allowed Satan to test Job in almost any way possible. His family died. His possessions were destroyed. His livestock was slaughtered. His body was covered with boils and sores. But Job's wife did not die. Out of all those things that were taken away, Satan looked at this situation and said, you know what? His suffering would be greater if I left her alive. This is not the type of woman you want to be married to. We see this in Job chapter 2, verse 9. His wife proves to be this contentious woman. The book of Job is 42 chapters long. 42 chapters long, we have all this. And in chapter 2, verse 9, his wife comes to Job and says, why do you hold your integrity, curse God, and die? Thanks, honey. I appreciate the encouragement that you are offering during these tough times in my life. We live in a fallen world, and there's going to be a collective hardship that is not always a result of our direct sin. But if it is for the glory of God, we accept it as something greater than our own personal suffering, than our own sorrow, than our own hardship. We do this and we surround ourselves with the right people. We surround ourselves with the right spouse. We surround ourselves with the right congregation. We surround ourselves with the right community so that when we are in this collective boat, that we are all in together. And when this judgment comes, because it's going to come, anytime you get a collective group of people together, there's going to be more sin than there is going to be righteousness. But when that collective judgment comes, we're able to have people around us who encourage us, who disciple us, who hold us accountable, who help us in every way possible to overcome that storm. It's not going to be smooth sailing in this boat, not always. So who are we surrounding ourselves with? It's not just about our physical body and our physical safety. It is about our souls. The book of Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, these are all books of the Old Testament making very clear that many of the hardships that result in our lives are because of our country, our culture, and our congregation that we have chosen to be a part of. So how are we choosing that? Are we choosing that widely, or are we letting our culture and our country and our congregation slip into the neglect of God? This is not where we want to be. It's only going to cause hardship for us, and we're not going to have the people around us to encourage us. But I want to remind us of the message in Matthew chapter 16 as we're thinking about this, as we're thinking about this collective hardship. It's for the people like Hosea who are ministering in troubled times. Jesus says, for the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. So we really have three choices as we think about the judgment, the discipline that's going to come both individually and collectively. We can't go along with the culture and neglect what God has given us to do, neglect what God has given us in terms of morality. We can just go ahead and go along with the world. We can be unfaithful believers who profess trust in God but still neglect Him and go along with the world anyway. Or 3, we can continue in faithfulness, knowing that one day the Son of Man, Jesus Christ Himself, is going to come back and is going to repay for the deeds that we have done, for the work of our hands, for the words of our mouth. These are the choices that we have. One last thing as we come to Hosea. We're contemplating how to get in the game. It says here in 7 and then 10 through 11, the more they increase, the more they sinned against me. I will change their glory into shame. And then we go down to verse 10. They shall eat, not be satisfied. They shall play the whore, but not multiply, because the Lord has forsaken, or they have forsaken the Lord to cherish wine and new wine, which take away from understanding. What has overtaken the people here is not just a few instances of sin. It is very much a spirit of sin. And what we see is a spirit of sin impacts everyone and everything. Not just the individual, not just the family. It impacts everyone and everything. Just last month, we took up the Lottie Moon Christmas offerings, the Southern Baptist offering for international missions. It's named after a short little lady, Lottie Moon, who went to China and ministered to the nation of China. And there were other people. Eric Liddell was one of them who spent time in China just ministering, and the country was changed spiritually because of that. But generations after Eric Liddell and generations after Lottie Moon, China is one of the most restricted and closed-off countries to the gospel that there is on the face of the planet. And how did this happen without the generational neglect of the teachings of Lottie Moon, of the teachings of Eric Liddell, of the teachings of numerous missionaries who went there over the past several hundred years? And if we don't think, just because we are quote-unquote a Christian nation, that we can also slip and one day become a restricted and a hostile nation towards the gospel, then we are fooling ourselves, because it can happen, and it can happen very, very quickly. If generation upon generation we don't teach our children, if generation upon generation we don't disciple within the church, if we're not willing to get in the game and actually take an active process in the ministry of the Word for the sake of the gospel, then we too will slip. We look on countries like China and Southeast Asia and other places with judgment. We may justify it to ourselves and say that it is righteous judgment, but as we think about smacking down our brothers and sisters in Southeast Asia and other places around the world who are trying to minister to their own people, how do you think God looks at our country and the immorality and the deceit and the neglect of biblical morality that we're making a common part of our culture? How do you think he reacts to the church in America as we see this happening within our communities and within politics, and instead of sorrow for those people, instead of feeling a sense of urgency to share the gospel with them, we put up a wall and we make them an enemy, and we don't let them in and we don't let people out? How does God view us? Is our spirit going to affect more than just our own small congregation? Is it going to ripple out to our community, to our country, to our family, to our friends? Is it going to affect everything around us? I say that it will. And that's why I pray desperately that we have a spirit of morality, that we have a hope for the future. What kind of spirit would the community say that we have? I want to have the spirit of Jesus, because it's that spirit that Christ left with us on the cross with His blood, with His body being broken for our sins. And that's what we're going to celebrate here today. We're going to observe communion, and I'm going to invite the deacons if they will come forward. I'm going to invite Stephanie and Amy